Hello, everyone. I am the Typer. Those of you who are watching this probably know me because I don't have a huge following or anything. What you're listening to right now is an informal intro to a video that's called the BT Cycle. I'm recording the intro and outro right now, and I've recorded the actual script read, so this is just the opening bit. Anyways, this video was made because BT's releasing a new album as of today, like 2 weeks-ish. It's coming out on August 14th, and it's like July 30th right now. Anyways, I'm recording this intro to introduce my video, The BT Cycle. I originally started writing this, and then I realized maybe I should just turn it into a YouTube video. And the idea of the article was that I realized that as BT's new album, The Lost Art of Flaunting, is coming out in like 2 weeks, I noticed that BT seems to repeat himself a fair amount. And by repeat himself, I mean he tends to release a similar inspired album every certain number of years, and it happens right around the same time. And so I started looking at these phases in which BT moves from working on mostly electronica-based albums to the more mainstream dance music trends. I realized that essentially with the end of the past decade, we can kind of map out BT running through cycles of his music fascinations on a nearly predictable pattern. We're starting a third cycle this year from my perspective. This is all speculation and it's, just being silly. But surprisingly, BT's timing is extremely repetitive in the sense. The timing of his album releases this year and in the past 10 years, I could have mapped them out to almost to the day if I had known about this cycle. It's a little wild. Upon recognizing these similarities from one decade to the next, I decided to devise a map of releases that I call the BT cycle. I'll explain the cycle in this video, and I'll also deliver some predictions and analyses or details left out afterwards. This is all meant in fun, and an artist really releases their work when it's done, and it won't take long for people to notice how this cycle isn't really a pitch-perfect idea, but I found the patterns were just kind of fun to look at, and so I decided to turn it into a video. I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to throw one addendum in here just to kind of cover some bases ahead of time. I am not going to be including BT's film and orchestral score projects in this cycle map, which includes the release of an album called Electronic Opus. The reason I'm not including these is because I've never really paid attention to his orchestral work, but the real reason I didn't include them in the BT cycle is because I consider those things gigs in BT's life. BT gets orchestral and compositional work or scoring work for TV and film. He gets that when he can take it. They're harder opportunities. It requires funding. It requires BT to be hired in a sense. They're not guaranteed, and thus his ability to create and release them is more dependent on external forces instead of his own determination to make the project happen. BT can try to get himself a scoring job on a film as much as he can, but he doesn't really come into the studio and say, I have this whole, book full of music for your movie that I haven't seen yet. Let me, compose for it. It doesn't happen too often like that. And so I'm not really including it. Whenever BT finishes one of his dance-based albums or electronica albums, someone will sign them. It's just a matter of who. And in the case of his electronica albums, sometimes he just releases them on his own. This wasn't always the case for his career like any artist, but it's a pretty safe bet for him now. Thus, I'm making it kind of irrelevant to the conversation. Technically, Daggers would fall on the spectrum as well. It's an album he made with somebody else as a different artist identity. It's an independent release, and it's new wave. But I think his All Hail the Silence project is parallel to the movement towards old school tech. That's a part of a human's life cycle, similar to the 30-year media cycle. And we'll see that in his second cycle when I talk about it. Also worth stating, any attempt to perceive how BT thought or felt in this is obviously speculation. I don't speak for him here. I don't know him. This is just me postulating, but it's fun postulating. Hopefully, nobody be mean to BT. This is the BT cycle. The BT cycle is determined by its structure, first and foremost. This is because the cycle's first iteration is the most rudimentary and focused. EMA and ESCM don't really get included as part of any cycle, and I did this because those two albums were a part of an important phase in any artist's life, the exposure and popularity phase. BT's early singles and albums were really well loved in the UK, and these albums are much more personal expressions of phases and moments in his life without the scope and breadth of BT realizing the many places he eventually wants to take himself with music. Despite the fact that by ESCM, BT was already a part of a wave of people who were pioneering new sounds or styles, the future albums were only dreams and wishful thinking at the time instead of projects that BT knew he could get to in a matter of time. So I don't include them. Cycle 1. Movement and Still Life through this binary universe. BT's commercial career was successful, but no album in his first 4 are quite as prolific and far-reaching as Movement and Still Life. Flaming June may be the dance song that defines his early years' heyday, and ESCM tracks get remixed more than Movement and Still Life ones, but Movement and Still Life is the album that people look to as the one that illuminated what's possible when BT is doing dance music with all cylinders firing. The UK version of the album starts wild with breakbeat, techno, and hip-hop tracks, before moving into a barrage of vocal and instrumental trance tracks that are remembered to this day among its peers. And then the album ends on the other BT track that has been popular for the gamut of his career, Satellite. The US release of Movement and Still Life was a softer version of the UK album, swapping the lengthier continuous album mix for a series of shorter radio-friendly tracks and more hip-hop and rap-focused tracks to try and gain the favor of US markets. For what it's worth, Love on Hate Street, which is exclusive to the US version of the album, and Shame as well, are phenomenal in my book, and these sides of BT are severely undervalued in his music. Movement and Still Life, which we can see was released in 1999 and then in 2000 for the US version, propelled BT's career forward as he began pioneering for the development of technology to meet his musical ideas. 3 years later, BT released his next dance-focused album, Emotional Technology. On this album, we can see the early signs of what he's trying to do with music technology in the vein of tracks like Simply Being Loved, where Stutter editing techniques made its early big game show-off to land the track a world record for the most number of vocal edits. Emotional Technology, however, received a more mixed reception for its foray into non-dance music moments that were rock-heavy. The album was also steeped in a more pop culture sensibility from its visual aesthetics to its earlier tracks, though that has little to do with the actual performance of the album itself in the long run. For reasons we will get into, Emotional Technology marked the last dance album in the first BT cycle. 3 years later, BT went on to release his first electronica album that has defined a chunk of his cyclical career works, This Binary Universe. This album is often hailed as one of the best works you can listen to from BT, and it's where he first unabashedly lets other influences in his life take hold in musical form: orchestral music, technological implementation into musical expressions, and general electronica pieces. The album released in 2006 and was developed during a period of BT's life where he got to score films and began raising his daughter while he was also trying to solidify the product that would later become the Stutter Edit plugin. It is in the development, release, and post-release of this binary universe that I want to illustrate how some of BT's album releases marks the end of one cycle, or the shifting into another cycle, and how these cycles are not necessarily the same as what I've marked in the above picture as musical eras. Movement and Still Life, Emotional Technology, This Binary Universe, they all sound unique from each other, but they are all relegated to a group of sounds and musical forms that, when grouped together, they sonically define BT's place in life. This is a reality for practically any artist that puts enough of themselves into their work at a regular enough pace. Movement and Still Life is BT trying to get a hand on every dance genre he can in the scope of one continuous mix. It's him having fun still. Emotional Technology is an earlier version of BT towing the line between electronic rock and the blurred similarities between trance and house music. These two warring genres he eventually brought together seamlessly in These Hopeful Machines, but more on that later. In that moment, BT's songwriting got a bit more serious and personal, though Movement and Still Life also had its moments. And This Binary Universe is BT moving away from 8 years dominated by dance music life, and instead moving towards a time spent working on things BT was also passionate about: music technology, conducting, composing, and being a human by helping raise one. Beginning in 1999 and 2000 with Movement and Still Life, through the end of his time releasing and promoting This Binary Universe in 2006, BT started to cycle over by 2009, when singles for These Hopeful Machines started releasing. He was back to dance music again. I wanted to illustrate the differences between BT's cycles and eras in BT's music, because his second cycle is marked with multiple eras and a larger structure. It'll be easier to get lost, so let's get the structure defined now that we know how the cycles look. If BT cycles are defined by their structure as I have stated, then this first cycle determines its structure is as follows. 1. Turn of the decade. Dance-focused album that illuminates capacities for multiple genres working together in one artistic album expression with the realization of new technologies. 2. Short stint of releases, one more album maybe after the turn of the decade, before going away in the mid-decade. Potentially, there will be a dance-focused album, but BT also more or less uses the moment at the turn of the decade to propel himself headfirst into something that's strange, alien, or even non-conventional for himself. This part of the BT cycle structure gets interesting during cycle 2. Number 3, an electronica album release. Time spent reflecting, developing new interests, technologies, and a change in personal life will give BT time to help develop and change up his sound drastically. Usually the later chunk of the decade is when number 3 happens. With the structure of a BT cycle now presented and explained, let's look at the second cycle and see how it holds up. Cycle 2. These hopeful machines, through everything you're searching for, is on the other side of fear. I promise I'm going to be shortening that name from here forward. These hopeful machines is often looked at as BT's moment of quote-unquote return to the dance music. This album took 4 years to work, and there was a large absence of him making dance music from 2003 to 2009, or 10. And while this won't completely line up later at the end of the 2010s, BT does repeat this absence in a sense, which we will cover later. These hopeful machines in many respects accomplishes what emotional technology felt like it was trying to do by performing a better balancing act and unabashedly going all in, weaving the things BT took from his time spent on this binary universe and putting it into dance music. These Hopeful Machines is an extremely dual-sided album that is fused by BT's interests that surfaced during this binary universe. For example, Suddenly, Every Other Way, Forget Me, Love Can Kill You, Always, and The Ghost in You are all variations of rock, bluegrass, breakbeat, or acoustic covers of new wave songs. The core of these genres is hidden in the album structure through the integrated weaving of electronic elements that BT developed when he was working on this binary universe and his Stutter editing toolsets. This production removes the sensation that Suddenly and Forget Me are just big rock songs and instead turns them into musical creations that could not exist without the interaction of technology into the mix. The same goes for The Ghost in You. It's a tape-recorded acoustic cover of a song by the new wave group The Psychedelic Furs. This song is woven into the fabric of an organic electronic musical experience. The other duality to these Hopeful Machines is dance music. The other 6 tracks on the album are The Emergency, The Light in Things, The Rose of Jericho, A Million Stars, Le Nocturne de Lumière, and The Unbreakable. All of these are exploring the capacity for electronica and orchestral elements to further influence trance music. Once again, BT's bringing his passions from this binary universe completely onto the table here. For example, The Emergency was a modern trance track with an electronic intro mixed with a piano, and then it has a very large orchestral outro. Le Nocturne de Lumière is a music theory experiment in shifting time signatures hidden within a baning glitch trance track. These Hopeful Machines isn't just weaving these ideas into various genres as individual tracks. It's weaving those disparaging genres, rock, breakbeat, trance, etc., into one album by using those genres in an even numerical split, 6 of one, 6 of another, and it's never really letting one of those genres hold the spotlight for too long before going back to the other. It also uses techniques learned from this binary universe to continuously carry you from one experience into the other as a seemingly continuous mix. In many ways, this album is almost correcting the things that people complained about from emotional technology by more or less masking or covering up or transforming the music from one distinct genre into an entirely new thing. If Movement and Still Life was all cylinders firing for BT to give you a fantastic time in dance music, then These Hopeful Machines was BT combining genres to give you a fantastic time in both dance and non-dance music, while using electronica, orchestrals, and music theory to trick you that you didn't even feel the difference between the two at all on. Next to this binary universe, These Hopeful Machines is the other album hailed as BT's great work, his magnum opus. And honestly, considering the above exploration of how this album starts BT's second cycle, it's fair to say that might be true. The 1-2 punch of BT finding strength in exploring his other passions through this binary universe, followed up by those passions reinforcing what he can do with commonplace music genres in These Hopeful Machines, resulted in one decade, from 2000 to 2009, featuring 3 albums, and then the next decade, from 2010 to 2019, featuring 7. We'll get into this later, but Cycle 2 is much larger because of changes to BT's journey as an artist like what we see here. The second BT cycle moves onwards with the first release of BT's own pioneered musical software, Stutter Edit. This added fuel to the already strong fire going on in the dance music industry at the time. It was well underway in electro music revitalization, attributed to the ongoing releases of Skrillex. Stutter Edit didn't necessarily change the game so much as BT was adding to the changes going on in the dance music industry at the time when it came out. BT continued to tour for These Hopeful Machines. Stutter Edit came out in 2011, and BT regularly had podcast episodes called Laptop Symphony. They featured him playing with Stutter Edit's capabilities, and the apex of the electro music revitalization in 2012 was met with BT releasing a compilation called Laptop Symphony in May. It was a 2-disc mixture of tracks that illuminated how BT was still going strong in current dance music trends, and he could find interesting ways to make even mixes of music from other artists almost seem like album experiences. Laptop Symphony was really formative as to why I started making mixes, that and the Intrude Deep compilations. It was in the way that you can take music from other people and still make it feel like it's an experience put out by one entity that really influenced me. It really made me think more about this whole DJing thing. A month later, in June of 2012, BT released a tangential album in a similar vein to This Binary Universe. It was called If the Stars Are Eternal, So Are You and I. Fans of this album considered it a similar album to that of This Binary Universe, and by the end of the decade, If the Stars Are Eternal was retroactively considered what's called a This Binary Universe volume, with this album taking the title This Binary Universe Volume 2. The same exact day in June of 2012, BT also released a meditative ambient work called Mursho Subrosa. It's one of the most standout and alien works of BT's discography that would later get a follow-up in 2019. In this microcosm here of releases spinning outwards from 2010 onwards, we can see the BT cycle now has smaller cycles within itself. BT releases a new technology that heavily advances his ability to make music, and in the explosion of a major dance album release to go alongside that technology change, BT makes even more music of different types. In August of 2013, BT released the next follow-up to his dance-focused albums, A Song Across Wires. Here's where you can really start seeing the BT cycle repeat itself. Movement in Still Life from 1999-2000 was repeated by These Hopeful Machines in 2010, and Emotional Technology in 2003 was repeated by A Song Across Wires in 2013. All four were 10 years apart from their respective siblings. Despite the differences in each album paralleled from one decade to the next, Emotional Technology and A Song Across Wires both do feature tracks that have remained standout moments in BT's musical history. And yet, both albums have received mixed feelings over time, whereas Emotional Technology was criticized for its heavier reliance on non-dance genres and its pop sensibilities that have no place in dance music. A Song Across Wires was the opposite. It was criticized for jumping on the mainstream dance music train too strongly, while Western countries like America had found themselves wholeheartedly embracing new twists on dance music. For BT, an American, this moment in his life where A Song Across Wires came out, it must have been like his home country finally embracing him for the stuff he had been making all along. A Song Across Wires was him making the stuff America wanted in droves at the time. Both albums still have their moments when they lean a bit more towards an introspective state, despite their appeal to broader commercialized musical interests. For example, Skylarking is a very traditionally structured trance track. Despite its slower speed, it features a sense of a crescendo, and it was inspired by a beautiful walk in the woods. It's really simple, it's lovely. Shortly following this traditionally minded trance song, the album plays a shift and a focus toward mainstream EDM trends with the track Letting Go. Letting Go, not to be confused with the Disney song, sings about frail and dangerous relationships, and it literally lets go of these old school trance styles in Skylarking by throwing in a massive dubstep drop. A year later, in 2014, BT released beat production toolset Break Tweaker, and while he did go on to start making electronic opus, BT mostly didn't release dance music from 2014 onwards. He got married the same year, and he was moving away from time spent over the past 8 years looking inwards, creating new stuff, and becoming the artist he had made himself to be. It's at this point that we are shifting musical eras into the musical era labeled marriage, nostalgia, and the future. It's another one of the microcycles. In many ways, the release of the Break Tweaker plugin can be seen as another start of one of these microcycles referred to with the Stutter Edit plugin. From 2014 to 2016, we heard whispers of the All Hail the Silence project. They did tour with Erasure for a season, and they released a 4-track EP on vinyl. And we saw BT slowly rebuild his studio and move into his new life with his wife, Lacey. Electronic Opus project did take up a considerable amount of time. I know he did some television composing projects in that time frame. I know he did some composing for Disney. He made a guest mix on one of the In Search of Sunrise compilations, and he took some time getting new equipment. Then, in the fall of 2016, BT released an album project that was released without a name. It would retrospectively get labeled the third volume in the TBU series. Since BT couldn't put an album on iTunes without a name, he left the name as an underscore in the text field. Fans such as myself have wound up calling it underscore in the years since. I already wrote about this album extensively. Needless to say, the 3 core tracks to the underscore EP are core to the album itself. These tracks were designed as large compositions featuring micro movements that reflect a lot of different work creations, large and small. One 2-minute piece in the album is music written from BT's honeymoon. Another whole composition was written on a flight taking off from Tokyo in the middle of a storm. There's a 60-second chunk in another track in a specified fashion of making sounds to play to our ears at what feels like spinning and curved angles that move upwards. Or another 8-minute chunk of one composition is a literal modular musical matrix running its sequence. Underscore is in many ways the early signs of how BT's changes in his life were reflecting in his workflow. He was creating micro projects and experiments that would help him change how he makes sounds and music in the future. Underscore was an experience in which BT let some of those creative experiments be the album, bones and all. These explorations were seemingly happening as BT was getting settled into the next phase of his life, which was going to be influenced by some degree to notions of nostalgia, with his All Hail the Silence project taking a larger foothold in his life. In 2016, fans were already hungry for another BT dance-based album, and it wasn't here yet. And across 2017, BT released 4 trance tracks that made people think a new dance album was on the horizon, myself included. Those tracks were The Upside Down, LSTM 4, and Yahweh. It wasn't here yet, though, not yet, because BT's second microcycle had not yet run its course. 2018 didn't see a lot of releases outside of one single. I presume a lot of this had to do with BT and Christian Burns finishing out their collaboration album as All Hail the Silence. The album was called Daggers. But BT was also working on other projects at the time. Daggers released in January of 2019, and Howard Jones's new album Transform released 4 months later, which featured 3 collaborations with BT. All Hail the Silence then went on touring as the opening act for Howard Jones's album tour. And a summer-long tour may seem like a really busy time to keep you away from creating, and yet it also doubled as a time for BT to continue making music. His new work methods had resulted in some strong productivity from the looks of things. His utilization of instruments old and new and his seemingly now regular life that he had found in his marriage led 2019 to see the release of Daggers in January, Between Here and You in October, and Everything You're Searching For is on the Other Side of Fear in December. 3 album releases in 1 year. Between Here and You functioned as a follow-up in Notion to Morsho Subrosa. It created an album that much more reflects a meditative experience. But as I realized in my review of it, BT has found a way to create a meditation album that wasn't so abstract that most listeners would just bounce off of it. Morsho Subrosa is very abstract and very... The ideas in Between Here and You were really well refined, but they still managed to be complex. This was slightly new territory for BT, but not necessarily unheard of. Meanwhile, Everything You're Searching For was immediately being hailed by BT as This Binary Universe Volume 4, which made the fan-based naming convention a mental mainstay. Everything You're Searching For was the next album of BT's cross-pollinating of electronic music, orchestrals, and the self-reflective experiences. And here is where the second cycle, and its second microcycle, came to an end. And realizing that we're reaching a third BT cycle now, I thought back on my review of Everything You're Searching For, and the link between 2 excerpts from it. I'm going to put it up on the screen, but I'm reading it. BT's not at some musical diverging crossroad of interests here, vying to build his electronic and orchestral interests as a retreat while turning into a dad or just losing interest in what there is to do in club music at the moment. Instead, BT's very interested in how AI is going to replace artists in our day and age. He's living a happy life with his wife and daughter, and he's fulfilling his musical dreams. Not to mention, club music right now isn't at some disinteresting impasse. It's maintaining a status quo, and further becoming more relevant as a pop cultural influence in the US. With tracks so mostly devoid of the numerous layers we normally get out of a BT album, it's possible this album could generate a perspective all the more paratextual. I'm genuinely curious to see if any of these compositions manage to turn into club tracks all their own. So much here is teeming with possibility, and it really does feel possible that the key to our next big journey with BT is something opposite of our comfort zone. It's sitting in the midst of what we're afraid of letting BT be and do at times. Let's jump headfirst into that fear and see where BT takes us next. So what did we learn from that cycle? Well, let's look back at that structure breakdown. Turn of the decade, we have a dance-focused album that illuminates capacities from multiple genres working together in one artistic album expression with the realization of new technologies. Yup, These Hopeful Machines definitely covers that. 2, a short stint of releases, one more album after the turn of the decade before going away in the mid-decade. Also, he released This Binary Universe 2, he released Morsho Subrosa, 2 compilations, and then a Sonic Cross Wires, which was followed by Mostly Silent for a few years. 3, electronica album release, time spent reflecting, developing new interests, technologies, and a change in personal life that gives BT time to develop and change up his sound drastically, usually the later chunk of the decade. With a big asterisk. This Binary Universe 2 and Morsho Subrosa came out before the hiatus for BT, but underscore, Between Here and You, and Everything You're Searching For were very much BT exploring what he's going to do in the next phase of his musical life and getting it started after a couple of years of mostly silence for his solo projects. I attributed those insertions of additional electronica albums from This Binary Universe 2 and Morsho Subrosa as a way of looking at the past BT cycle as 2 smaller cycles, almost making the cycle itself larger and longer paced compared to before. It's almost like the visual of the golden ratio in a sense, which BT himself has made a song about. Weird. Anyways, a lot of Cycle 2 was also dominated by BT's nostalgia kicking in due to him simply aging as a person. BT got old musical equipment back in his life that he had in his early days and got them restored. All Hail the Silence as a project is a literal callback to and modernization of trends from the new wave genre from the 70s and 80s. And BT's upcoming album, which we'll talk about further in a second, is called The Lost Art of Lawning. And BT has declared it is named from the beauty of letting some things getting old and coming back to them after we've had time to let them sit so we can appreciate them more. He has openly declared influences and instruments from EMA, ESCM, and more are being brought back into the fold on this album. Needless to say, nostalgia was a big part of BT's development over the past cycle, and now we're seeing how that's going to impact whatever this next era is. I left the next era on the BT cycle map as marriage, nostalgia, and the future, but honestly, we don't quite know what this era is going to feel like just yet. We just know we're in a new cycle, and here's why. Cycle 3, Stutter Edit 2, and The Lost Art of Lawning. So if these cycles are a real thing, how do we know we're in a new cycle? Well, for starters, it's a new decade, and BT has a new dance-based album out very soon. Considering the leading singles on this album that push styles of progressive house, modern trance, and breakbeats, we're definitely seeing a fairly diverse album mix so far. The preview site hints at 14 tracks. I'm recording it right now, and there's only been 3 singles out and no other tracks announced. I'm going to assume that the count on the website is 14 tracks because that's what I see. That might come out after this video comes out. I don't know. Anyways, while we don't exactly know how much we will enjoy The Lost Art of Lawning for it to line up with Factor 1 of any BT cycle, it is an album coming to us after his extended time releasing non-dance-based projects, and it's a new decade as well. The release of Stutter Edit 2 in the month before the album's release kind of solidifies this advancement of new technologies that will also contribute to BT's workable capabilities for this new album. He was probably using this program before the product came out. Points 2 and 3 on the structure of that BT cycle, we'll kind of have to wait and see if they take place in this decade, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't look at some fun details here about cycles and BT in general. For example, The Lost Art of Lawning releases on August 14th, 2020. Now, the timely release of music by an artist it's really all down to when it's done, ideas mixed with release schedules from labels, as well as what gets promised for support, what is the perceived or predicted best time to launch these albums. Look, albums are still products. Leading singles come out first, you want enough time for fans to know about the album and where to get it, etc., etc. Paul Marketing is doing his job. Simply put, this is all really just kind of a coincidence, except BT does control his workflow. So that has some sort of an impact on all of this, but for some odd reason, August is just a hot month for BT. He has released more studio albums in August than any other month, with The Lost Art of Lawning putting that count to number 4. October comes in second with 3 albums. So that's just kind of sort of interesting to me. For the record, the 4 August albums outside of The Lost Art of Lawning are Emotional Technology, This Binary Universe, and A Song Across Wires. The other element that's available for us to consider is the impact of The Lost Art of Lawning as an album and the speculation of what BT's new musical era is going to be. Most of BT's electronica albums over the past decade have really tried to include conversations and sounds related to the re-implementation of old school hardware into BT's working toolset. And while we've seen how well that can help him make more emotive and personal music with his electronica projects and All Hail the Silence, the most we've seen these changes really influence his club music is in the street of singles from 2017 to 2020. Tracks like For Yahweh and Atari's Lantern are really showing how old hardware is influencing his modern dance music. So far, I'm going to sound like a pessimist here, but the leading singles for The Lost Art of Lawning have been impressive mainly because they have good songwriting and good vocal performances, and it has less to do with the musical advancements in place. The rest of the album so far has been mostly familiar, but we've only seen 3 tracks as well, so it's kind of hard to comprehend where this is going for the time being. There is an exception to this, and it's that I think BT's returning to breakbeat on the track The War is fantastic. BT doing breakbeat is a rarity, and it really shouldn't be because it's really good. However, BT's next musical era, I think, leaves much more room for speculation compared to The Lost Art of Lawning. I think the more catchy and emotionally charged elements of The War and No Warning Lights, which are the 2 leading singles from this album, show a side of BT that we're really going to see more of in the future. BT's music has always been personal, but it's really personal in specific ways. The music has always been vague enough for the most part in terms of expressing BT's personal life experiences. He covers over his private life, basically. It's really clear that there's mixtures of love and relationship frailty and emotional technology. It's an album that gets progressively darker as it goes, but it's only really starkly clear on tracks like Circles. Satellite, meanwhile, it was apparently inspired by a really personal and deep conversation one night on a hillside, but we never really know what that conversation was. Do we need to? No, and I don't think we ever will for a lot of BT's works. His reliance on that barrier between the author and the narrator is really useful in making his music apply to a wider swath of people. But when also looking at the very exposed and reduced elements of BT's music that we got in Between Here and You, and even more so on Everything You're Searching For, it leads me to believe BT's going to spend less time making his music in the next musical era quite as packed. BT once explained that the moment he stops making his tracks is the moment when it feels like it's too packed or too cluttered, and he pulls back a little bit from there to get the end result he wants. I think this really well sums up BT's music with one added caveat. BT's idea of what too cluttered means is something like 25 to 40% more cluttered than what most other artists think human brains and ears can process and enjoy. As a result, BT will also time his clutter really well. It creates what feels very much like an organized chaos sometimes. Just take a look at tracks from These Hopeful Machines for this. There are so many layers at once. I think we're going to be seeing him draw back on his clutter a lot more in the future. Even tracks like The War and No Warning Lights spend more time focusing on simplistic designs to allow the melodies, which is something else that BT's really good at, to create newer types of strengths in his music. No Warning Lights features unique instrumentation and dual vocals alongside to make a more entertaining song first, and then it's a cool electronic song second. The Wars works similarly, with a breakbeat design working really well in pace with the vocals, only breaking away to do its own cool thing when appropriate. I take this to predict that BT's next musical era will see the artist allowing room for emotional expression in ways people would consider more traditional in music, and BT will be supporting those methods as well as he can. This is just speculation, it's just a guess. This is just speculation, it's totally a guess. But based on the changes in his direction that we've seen over the past 5 to 6 years, I think this is kind of where BT's going next. For many longtime fans, this may be considered BT stripping away at one of the most fundamental things that has made him an interesting artist, his complexity. To address that, I think I'll say that I don't think BT's songs from The Lost Art of Lawning or future tracks are going to have less layers in them. So much as I think BT's going to let emotions be the driving force in his music more than before. We can see hints of this in some of the strongest moments in his past two albums. Everything You're Searching For had some quaint and dark tinged moments, and they were so strong because BT worked on a much more foundational level with fewer perceived layers than usual. Meanwhile, Between Here and You didn't let the complexity of his layers dictate that the runtime of the musical expression be long. Some of the strongest moments on that meditative album were short and strong because of what BT was guiding us to feel, more so than how we got there. He let the expressions and the emotional moments be elevated when important. And I think when you compare that to the still amazing 11-minute journey that tracks like Our Dark Garden take you on, it becomes clear that we get a very different effect from BT's music when he, intentionally or not, puts a limiter on the length of his music. Restrictions create new dynamics in artists that we normally don't get to see every day. And I hope to see this happen with BT's music more, despite him having more equipment than he ever would have dreamed of owning. That leaves the last thing to discuss, impact. See, one thing I didn't cover in the cycles is the importance and impact of his albums over the span of time. BT's not somebody who necessarily changes the way the music industry works or anything, but he is a pioneer for himself, and so that does influence other people. The thing he pioneers changes how he works, and it makes his ideas more possible than before. Part of this is determined by his life, part of this is determined by whatever's fascinating his brain, and part of it's going to be determined by the music around him. And as we enter the burning 20s of this century, one change-up in BT's life is definitely incoming. BT's daughter is likely entering adulthood in the next few years. BT has made his life with his family mostly private, and I believe we should all respect that. Let's get that out of the gate. But to think that the impact of a person's child growing up to be an adult and navigating those changes would have zero impact on one's musicianship seems insane to me. I do think that's going to have some sort of a outcome in his music, even if it's just one track. Another thing that has marked our musical realm, especially in the West for the past decade, is the persistence of 80s music tropes to never really call it quits. BT's going to continue making music as All Hail the Silence. They have said they're working on a second album, and I'm okay with that. He's going to continue to love on new wave in the modern day, and I'm totally okay with that. Daggers really grew on me as 2019 went onwards, so I welcome this. One thing I do hope with confidence, though, is that the electronic producers in general start slowing down on musically emulating the 80s sounds, unless really intentional. Acts like The Midnight and All Hail the Silence are specifically invoking 80s instrumentation sounds and making reference to certain new wave groups of the past. But I hope BT as himself and other artists learn to leave that aesthetic behind for a while. Trance was really heavily ushered in during the 90s, and as that decade is now coming into the 30-year cycle, there's some fantastic opportunity for appreciating 90s trance sounds and aesthetics, and revisiting that history. Combining that with some of the fascinations BT has found himself chasing as of late, like smaller scale tech that determines how music gets made, or AI that builds music, it might make for some truly influential music this decade. Whether or not this next decade really does hold a new cycle in BT's music that repeats common threads and ideas in different fashions kind of remains to be seen. But if we are going to experience a third cycle, I'm looking forward to seeing it be more than the one before. Thanks for watching.